In part 1 of this video, we examined how Christians will farm the Old Testament by parachuting down on anything that sounds like Jesus and then plucking it out from context, or even text-altering these Jewish scriptures. We observed this with two popular prophecy fulfillment claims, Isaiah 7:14 and Zechariah 12:10. In this video, part 2, we are going to examine complete fabrication. With such zealous determination to convince readers that Jesus is a Jewish Messiah, we should take into deep consideration that when a Christian scribe draws out a correlation with any ancient Jewish literature, he is simply painting a picture of Jesus onto his blank canvas. Is this unreasonable? No, not at all. These early Christian scribes would have been very intimate with what we now call the Old Testament, and by the stroke of a pen, instantly create fulfillment prophecies out of thin air. The Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, once said, "History is a set of lies agreed upon." Indeed, this has been the habit of men. The truth is, historians have barely secured enough evidence to prove Jesus even existed, much less whether or not he actually rode into town on a donkey to fulfill an ancient Jewish prophecy. My friends, you cannot assume these Christian books are historically accurate. They do not provide us with a stamp of authenticity. A Christian must first show that the overabundance of magical tales found in the New Testament are true historical events, before these fulfillment claims can be considered seriously. The New Testament fails at these provisions. If the New Testament is filled with magical events that defy reality or outlandish stories, then we run into a real problem with these so-called fulfillment prophecies being trustworthy. Asking if Christian scribes have fabricated stories in order to piggyback the Old Testament is not only a valid question, but there is ample evidence to point towards or even vindicate this suspicion. There are many places in the New Testament where Christian scribes have overreached the bounds of credibility in order to explain how Jesus matches up with Jewish literature. For an example of this overly determined effort, let's look at a passage in the Old Testament book of Micah, which is commonly used by Christians as a messianic fulfillment claim. "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from everlasting." Here lies the problem. In the New Testament, Jesus is not known as Jesus of Bethlehem, but Jesus of Nazareth. When he had entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Micah says this Messiah will be from Bethlehem of Ephrathah, not Nazareth of Galilee. According to Micah, it can't be Jesus. The New Testament scribes realized this critical problem, and therefore set out to fix it in the 2nd chapter of Luke. Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. We are told that Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem for a census when all the inhabited earth went back to their hometowns. When we think about it logically, this great migration becomes absurd. When a government is conducting a census, it is because they want to know how many people are living in each city in order to budget or tax properly. Having everybody migrate to their home of origin makes no sense. Furthermore, we can't even begin to imagine the chaos such a widespread decree would lead to. The cities would become disaster areas, with masses of people coming and going and nobody staying in one place. The confusion and disruption to everyone's lives would be astronomical. Furthermore, during the height of Rome, whereas we have untold historical accounts of daily and political life preserved, historians cannot find a trace of such an event. Notice how this New Testament author inserts how this was the very first census ever taken of a particular ruler. The author would have known that nobody has ever heard of such a mass migration before. Furthermore, with Mary being 9 months pregnant, why would she need to go with Joseph? Certainly a woman in her final month of pregnancy would never make such a difficult journey. Was this required of by all women in their final months of pregnancy? This story is a logical absurdity. But for the writers of the New Testament, Mary had to give birth in Bethlehem, which was the birthplace of King David. And the New Testament writers had to figure out a way to get her there. This story, in all likelihood, was completely fabricated in an effort to legitimize Jesus as being the Messiah foretold in Micah. And this is not the only place where early Christian scribes are suspect of overreaching the bounds of credibility. The hometown of Jesus, Nazareth, was a very small village that had never been mentioned in any Jewish lore. The biblical insignificance of Nazareth was clearly a nagging problem for early Christian scribes. The author of Matthew makes a bold, perhaps even a reckless claim that Nazareth was actually foretold in the Old Testament. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. The problem with this claim is that he shall be called a Nazarene does not occur anywhere in the Old Testament or any other Jewish text. However, when we scroll back to the Old Testament to locate what Matthew is referring to, we are led to the book of Judges. For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb. And he shall deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Due to a mere coincidence, this verse does contain similarity to the hometown of Jesus, which may have overly excited the author of Matthew. But clearly we can see how this verse is speaking about Samson. And this is not the only problem. This verse also says that the child shall be a Nazarite. The author of Matthew simply changed the word to Nazarene. A Nazarite was someone who practiced a religion similar to Buddhism. Neither does this word Nazarite have any known link to the name of any town. The likely scenario here is that it was so important for this Christian scribe to transform Nazareth into a place fit for a Jewish God king that he desperately farmed the Old Testament and settled with Judges 13:5. The one thing we can establish with certainty is that there was no doubt a strong motive for early Christian scribes to fabricate correlations or even text alter Jewish literature because they were trying to convince and convert others. It's sales. We should not be so surprised when we see the New Testament drawing off of these older religious books, such as when Matthew mentions Judas and 30 pieces of silver, in correlation with a passage found in Zechariah, even though Matthew makes a mistake by saying it comes from the book of Jeremiah. Well, they sound close enough. This is precisely how religions evolve, century upon century. They continue to build off of one another. Consider the 12 apostles. This number 12, no doubt, mirrors the 12 tribes of Israel. What is suspicious is that historians know nothing about the majority of these 12 magical men, with only a few having any historical legend, as if most of them never even existed. A notion that most of the apostles are fabricated characters has long been noted by historians. Consider the author of Revelation, who mirrors the book of Daniel with his illustrations of animals and strange word pictures. When we are dealing with these correlations, we might remind ourselves that people are not always looking forward, but more importantly, they are looking backwards. In fact, they are farming. In this way, humans will tend to self-actualize prophecies and carry their lore into future generations. These religions surviving for thousands of years is not as marvelous as it might appear on the surface. I have time to address one more fulfillment claim in this Part 2 video, and will examine several more in Part 3 and 4. For a good example of how Christians are farming the Old Testament with their Jesus glasses on, let's take a look at Isaiah 9:6, another very popular messianic fulfillment claim. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Wow, this certainly does sound Christian. But there is a problem. This entire passage, in context, is not talking about a future Messiah. Jewish historians explain how this passage is referring to King Hezekiah, the 13th king of Judah, in which the book of Kings refers to him as the righteous king. Hezekiah had removed pagan altars, temple images, restored monotheistic practice, and maintained peace throughout his kingdom. This passage is simply God expressing himself through Hezekiah, the Prince of Peace, the Everlasting Father. Christians also mistakenly believe that such titles can only be applied to God himself. In the Old Testament, this is not always the case. In the book of Psalms, we read, I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. It is not unusual for Jewish literature to cause confusion in this regard. It is also important to understand the past and present tense use of language when trying to establish a verse that is messianic or prophetic. The verse we are dealing with here, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, is present tense. King Hezekiah had already been with them. If it were future tense, it would use the verb will be born and will be given to us, and in context would be suggesting a future or prophetic tone. This verse is not. Folks, perhaps the very best evidence for Christianity or Jesus being non-existent in the Old Testament is the Jews themselves. The vast majority of first-century Jews remained unconvinced by Christian theology or the magical stories built around Jesus. These Christian efforts held little sway over those who were actually there, and who actually understood their own holy books. If Jesus was clearly represented in Jewish text, or actually performed miracles accompanied by wondrous magical events, then the opposite should be expected, with the majority of Jews becoming strong believers. This is not the historical case. Rather, Christianity has had a very difficult time convincing Jews that Jesus and Christian theology can be found in Jewish literature. The fact that Christianity became adopted and popularized primarily by Greek pagans speaks volumes. Perhaps the Jews can shed more light on this subject than one might realize. Stay strong and wise, my friends. It can get crazy out there.